Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. The Board of Control of Cricket in India, BCCI, recently announced equal match fees for its women and men international cricketers. While the reactions has been mostly positive and this move has been welcomed, a behind-the-scenes look actually suggests that this might be inadequate to achieve actual gender equality in pay when it comes to sports. In this episode, my colleague Carl and I, Shrikrishna, will briefly discuss the history of the equal pay movement, why women get paid less than men in sports, and the reason why the proposed hike in match fees by the BCCI is really just a drop in the ocean when it comes to ensuring actual pay parity. Welcome to ATP, Carl.
Thanks, Sri. Great to join you on this episode. Very interesting topic that we can delve into.
Definitely. So, why don't you start by taking us through the recent move announced by the BCCI, which has been touted as the first step to achieving gender parity in pay when it comes to sports?
Yeah. No, in fact, the background to this is that the women's side went on to win a silver medal at the 2022 Birmingham Commonwealth Games, despite losing to Australia in the final. But this brought a lot of glory to the women's game here in India. And I think it was decided by the BCCI that the match earnings for the women's team will have to be equal to that of the men's game. So just to take you through the numbers, for the test match format, they would be also getting a match earning of 15 lakhs per test match. There'll be 6 lakhs paid to them for a one-day international game and 3 lakhs for a 2020 international, right? So, but it's important to note here that these are only match fees, the earnings that they get from playing a match, right? So this is essentially the pay hike that was introduced by the BCCI, but we can of course get to some of the finer details of what this means.
Sure. So I wanted to ask you, since you stressed on the fact that these are just match fees, so what do you mean? Like, how does it really differ? Because as far as BCCI is concerned, it is just paying the match fees to its cricketers, right?
Sure. Yeah. So as far as the BCCI is concerned, there are annually contracted players as well, right? So apart from the match earnings that they get, they are on a contract. Now, and this is where maybe the recent hike, really there's a lot to, sort of unpack in terms of the real impact of this is going to be. Because, when you look at something like a central contract between the men's and the women's team, it's divided into grades. So you have a grade A plus, you have a grade A, grade B, and grade C. Now, in the men's cricket grading slabs, a grade A plus cricketer gets about 7 crores,
Right.
INR. Whereas in the women's game, they get only about 50 lakhs in annual salary.
Okay.
So when you look at the contractual sort of agreements, that's not really tackled in this proposed hike. Like, it's only for the match earnings. And, if you go like even further down the sort of grading slabs, a grade C cricketer, which is in fact the lowest grade, gets about 1 crore.
Which is still more than a grade A women cricketer.
What a women cricketer gets. So that's really where, a lot of the focus has been on since, the pay hike was introduced. And and also in terms of like whether this will in fact have a significant impact on the match fee, because all of this is dependent on the number of games they play. Right. And as we all know, the men's team play
more cricket.
They play more matches. So like in effect, the women will still end up paying considerably less than their male counterparts, right? Because for the sheer fact that they play fewer games than the latter.
Sure, thanks. Actually, these are interesting nuances, and at least in the initial coverage of this move by BCCI, a lot of this, I think, did not come out very clearly. So, a big PR win for BCCI for sure. But in any case, considering very few cricket boards have actually done this move from BCCI needs to be appreciated. But what do you think? What do you have to say about it?
Yeah, no, certainly this is a step in the right direction. In fact, if you take the big 3 cricket boards, India has certainly sort of, set the ball rolling in bringing out gender parity. But of course, there have been other cricket boards, for instance, Cricket Australia, the England and Wales Cricket Board, even the New Zealand Cricket Board, right? And these have offered domestic contracts to almost all their women players, right? And not just offering contracts to them, but also ensuring that this is equal to what the men's team earns. And specifically talking about the English Cricket Board, they're planning to, in fact, widen this sort of umbrella of players in their, sort of roster to accommodate all the 80 players that are part of the sort of the England women's cricket team. So, in fact, One of the arguments against this sort of pay hike is that it doesn't really have an impact on the domestic
Correct.
sort of cricket,
Yeah.
right? And maybe we can get into some numbers on that. But by and large, a lot of the cricket boards have thought about this in a serious way. And for India, this is really the first step.
Yeah. So I'm sure like the domestic game will also catch up sooner or later. Even in fact, like in India, at least, I'm sure the domestic cricketers are much better paid off. I don't know the case with domestic women cricketers. So how do they fare?
No, so in fact, this is one of the arguments that experts have sort of talked about in terms of whether this has an impact on domestic cricket. Because a lot of the time, the danger that faces domestic cricket in the women's context is that, a lot of these players, their economic situation is, quite precarious. So, in fact, they do look for other sources of income and not just from cricket. So, just to give you an instance, the match fees for a domestic women cricketer was recently increased back last year, and now it's about 20,000 per match, right? If you're in the starting 11, whereas if you are in the reserves, you get about 10,000 Indian rupees. Important to note here that these are the figures that are also paid to the under 19, sort of boys or men's team you call. While the senior men who play in the domestic circuit, they receive about double or triple of this amount, right? So that's what we're looking at. Like, in terms of promoting the sport at a grassroots level in the context of women, this probably, doesn't really go that far. And that's why there's a lot left to be desired.
So, let's take a step back from discussing cricket in specific and look at sports generally. So, and in fact, one of the main issues when it comes to feminist movements or gender rights movements has been bridging this wage gap, right? And it applies to sports equally. So, can you take me through like a brief sort of like picture of how did this equal pay movement come about, especially in the context of sports?
Sure. No, I think that context is quite important because it's quite recent, right? So it's only in 1973 when the American tennis legend and winner of almost 39 major titles, Billie Jean King, right? So she initiated this movement. It was called the Original Nine move, and Original Nine meaning it was Billie King along with 8 other female tennis players who fought for equal pay for women's tennis. And this led to the founding of the first president of the Women's Tennis Association, the WTA, as it's popularly called, in 1974. And yeah, just sort of talking about the Grand Slams, the US Open was in fact the first Grand Slam to hand the same amount of prize money, which by the way is not the case with most other sports where
Correct. Yeah.
the prize money differs
Right.
across the men's and women's tournaments. And then in 2001 and 6, the Australian French and the French Open followed suit. And then finally in 2007, the Wimbledon, which is the oldest Grand Slam, started to pay men and women the same amount of prize money. And I think one of the things that we also need to keep in mind is there's considerable media rights, like share of media rights, revenue from these broadcasting rights, which also go to the players. Right?
Okay.
So if I wanted to mention this in the previous sort of segment, but the money bag of BCCI's annual media rights, women players at this point of time get only a 2.7% share as compared to the international men's players who gain about 13%.
Right.
And the domestic players, in fact, go on to get at least 10.3% from sort of the media sort of right share.
And this is this percentage which you mentioned, that is of the overall revenue which BCCI makes from all these different streams, or is it a percentage of that particular sport?
This is for the particular sport.
For the particular sport.
Yeah. Then for the particular tournament.
Right.
So if there's a World Cup happening, if there's a media right.
So men's World Cup happens and the men's team gets around 13%.
They are entitled to 13% of the share.
And if it's a women World Cup happens, and
it's around, it's about 2.7%.
Okay. Thanks, Carl. So let's take a short break now and come back with more on the pay gap in sports. Welcome back to All Things Policy. So, Carl, can we also get into the causes behind this, right? Can you talk a little bit about the reasons why women sports persons get paid less than men, and what could be the likely reasons as to why this has sustained over time despite increased commercialization of sports? So what explains this?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question to raise at this point, because the commercialization of cricket, I think, has come a long way, right? And we are seeing changes, rather like it would be baby steps, but still it is moving in the right direction. But by and large, some of these commercial, and it is a commercial sort of activity, right? It's a commercial event, sporting tournament. So what generally happens is the promotions for a women's game isn't even close enough to that of the men's game, right? So one way to look at it is that there's been a general discrimination in how the women's game is promoted, which then by extension means you don't get enough viewership, not enough eyeballs for that sport. And then there's that cycle, that vicious cycle of, how less promotions means less viewership, which means less revenue for the women sport itself. So there's obviously a commercial angle to this. The other one is really, there's a lot of star value that's attached to a lot of the men's players, right?
Right.
Take India, for instance, the brand endorsements that they get is, like astronomically higher, like compared to the women. So yeah, to an extent, fan following, star value that is attached to, men sports persons does have a factor as well. And since I also had pointed out in the previous sort of segment about how the prize money, right, at premier events also differs, which is a little baffling to me, because at the end of the day, the same sport is played.
Yeah.
So they play for the same 90 minutes, say in a football tournament, or in cricket, they still play the 50 overs. So that's always been a bit of a puzzle to me. So of course, there is a historical, sort of discrimination that is a factor in some of these conversations. And hence why maybe we'll get into that US women's soccer team case study in a while, which really tells you about how this, sort of entire conversation has changed, drastically over the years. And one of the things I think we should also maybe talk about in this context is, how the women's IPL is now going to become a reality, right?
Right.
So this is probably going to happen sometime next year. And, the base price of, an IPL team, women's IPL team, is going to be set at around 400 crores each.
Wow.
So that's a fairly large sort of number. And because this tournament is going to be sort of broadcast to a much larger audience, it will result in much larger investment for the women's sport and the revenue that they can make from it. So yeah, I mean, while it's not been smooth sailing when you talk about gender equality and pay parity in women's sport, but I think the signals have certainly been in the right direction. Yeah, I think so it's nowhere near what it needs to be, but I think the conversations are getting fairly
and
better.
especially in the context of India, one of the things that I can think of is the fact that there exists a lot of barriers, both infrastructural as well as social barriers to entering sports itself, right? And this applies to both men and women. But in the case of women, I'm sure these barriers are even more heightened because of their gender, because of the fact that, the families may not be willing to send their children to sporting facilities, because of the fact that they may feel less than comfortable at the coaching center, or the fact that, there is not adequate protection from sexual harassment or gender discrimination that they may face at a sporting facility. So this ensures that at the beginning itself there is screen, and there are more screens afterwards, and not all of these are actually about their abilities or talents to come up and perform good at a sport. And this just hinders sort of good sports persons from coming up, especially when it is about women's sports. So over time, what I think this can do is just bring out some differences in quality, which in turn translates into fan following or viewership. So that's one observation I had on the discussions that we had. So Carl, you also mentioned about this women national soccer case from the USA. So would you like to talk more about it and take us through what happened in this decision?
I mean, again, this is a historic sort of lawsuit, right? So basically what happened was the members of the US women's soccer team, I'm saying soccer here because in the US context, it's still football, guys. But, so they had actually reached a settlement with the Soccer Federation, right? That guarantees equal pay with the men's team, right? And essentially, at that point of time in the lawsuit, which was earlier this year, it offered players almost millions of rupees back in pay, right? Which they felt they were entitled to, which is almost $24 million was the settlement, and $22 million of which would go to the players who were part of this suit, which is the women's soccer team. Now, why it is interesting in this discussion of ours is that in the US, the women's soccer team actually been far more successful than the men's team, right? The men's team, in fact, failed to qualify even for the last World Cup, the last FIFA World Cup. And the women's, again, the soccer players have a substantially large platform than many of the men's players. So in time, what happened was the women's soccer team brought in more revenue than the men's. So their argument was basically that, they need to be paid equally, that, earnings from matches, was sort of below par, and they wanted to sort of get, greater earnings. And essentially, US Soccer had offered the same contract structure to both the men and the women. But apparently it was not. I mean, the women in a soccer team argued that they had not been offered the same dollar amounts, right? Even if the contract structure was the same. So this lawsuit has now come into effect, and what this essentially means is now the men's soccer team is playing in the FIFA World Cup, right? And they've just made it to the knockout stage, like today as we speak. And by virtue of having made it to the next round, they'll get a prize money of $13 million. Now, this $13 million is now going to be split with the US women's soccer team.
Right.
And that's where the lawsuit sort of comes in. And and because of this new equal pay agreement, they're going to split the prize money. And the two teams, I think, with the men's team sort of advancing, they'll receive about $6.5 million, almost as a minimum. And again, the interesting bit here is this $6.5 million that the men's team is going to get for qualifying to the next round is in fact more than what the women's soccer team got for winning both the 2015 and 2019 World Cups combined, right? Which was $6 million. So
Right.
that itself tells you its own story. But I think, this judgment is going to have ramifications even at the level of FIFA. So we're just talking about the soccer federation, but there might be an instance where the women's game is also going to get the same prize money as the men. So I think we're just a couple of years away from sort of bringing that equality in at least a prize money that both the games get.
And this is a very, I think, unique approach to resolving this issue, right? Like make both the teams share the prize money with each other. And this, I'm sure, like,
promotes the sport too.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and then money gets reinvested in that particular sport, and because we have better performance, I guess, over a period of time. So let's come back to Indian sports for a bit for the last few minutes. And I was wondering if you have thought of or come across any potential solutions in the Indian context to address this issue that we're talking about.
Yeah. No, so as I mentioned in the context of cricket, I think the women's IPL is going to be a game changer, right? Simply because now they're going to have that platform where their skills will be sort of put to the test, and there's going to be international cricketers. So it's certainly going to have a buzz. The tournament's certainly going to have a buzz around it. So I think the franchise model has worked, and if sponsors can sort of get behind women's sport, then that's certainly one solution where they actually earn more than let's say their match earnings. They can have other sources of revenue, and we are seeing that with a lot of sports. Badminton, for one, table tennis and badminton, for instance, gives equal prize money to both the men's and women categories, and this has been going on for many years. If you take a sport like hockey, for instance, while there's no equality in the prize money, the allowances and sponsorships are fairly balanced for both the men's and women's. So I think these are three sports that maybe cricket can maybe take a leaf out of, and the other sports as well. You would have been aware of the Target Olympic Podium scheme, right? The TOPS scheme, right? So which is designed to improve the performance of both men's and women's athletes. Now, according to the TOPS scheme, actually the monthly stipend is 50,000 for both men and women, right? So maybe introduction of schemes that sort of maintain this parity would be a good step. And I think, and at the end of the day, maybe if we talk about women's cricket, I think the annual contracts is where there's a lot of that's a sticking point, right? There's still a big gap. And I think if the contracts can be designed in a way that it promotes grassroots cricket, so rather than focus on the elite level, you start focusing on the domestic run, so that you get more women to play. At least they have a stability of income from the games that they play, and then you slowly sort of improve their chances of making it to the elite level, and then earning the same as that of the men's team. So giving a sense of that security to that women's cricketing ecosystem, I think, will be a lot more conducive for their growth, rather than just a pay hike which just goes on to just solve very little. But as you had pointed out earlier, it's really just a drop in the ocean, right? And still have a long way to go.
Yeah, right. So few interesting takeaways from whatever you said. First is, of course, commercialization has paid off. The more eyeballs any sports get, there is more popularity, which in turn kicks off a virtuous cycle. And over time, more sponsorships come in, more money flows in, and players get richer, right? And they get compensated for the efforts that they put in. And second is, of course, when government is instituting any scheme, I mean, they have a legal mandate. They cannot technically discriminate. So it's a good incentive. They expand such schemes and, pay enough, devote equal resources to to men and women's sports, so that the the pay gap is non-existent, because it's a state and they can't discriminate. And the real problem actually comes when you have private associations. Like almost all sports in India are run by private associations, and they are sort of engaging in this kind of a discrimination. So I don't know, like you said, the US approach for soccer, that at least with respect to prize money, bringing in some kind of a parity, I think that's a major incentive, right?
And the justification for them, right? The very fact that they've won World Cups is a reason enough to. And I think we often in our conversation in office moan about how the men's team isn't really progressing in tournaments. The women's team actually won, the Asia Cup, which our men's team couldn't. And so it's really about, if you want to talk about outcomes, I mean, if the outcome is to win a tournament, they have done that.
Exactly.
So I think the conversation has to take into account that it's not just the inputs that go into that sport, for instance, the broadcasting, spectator, but it's also the output of it. Like if a women's team is bringing laurels and sort of glory to the country, then there's certainly a case to be made, right? That they have to be compensated equally, or if not, at least better than their current.
And the last thing which you said was actually very crucial, that, instead of looking at ensuring parity at the top levels of a sport, start off from the bottom level, at the local level, at the club level, or at the district and state levels, because this ensures that a lot more crowd is drawn in. At the top, it may be a difference of few lakhs, which doesn't, in the longer run doesn't matter much, as opposed to a difference in few thousands at the bottom level, which can make a huge difference in, drawing women's sports persons. So ensuring pay parity at the bottom level, I feel, is even more crucial than we look at the top level.
And of course, the sponsorships have to follow. I think that's a really crucial element. Is if you look at other sports, for instance, barring cricket. But I think certainly focusing on the domestic domestic rungs will certainly will have better, sort of the desired consequences.
Exactly. So thank you for having this conversation, Carl. If you have any closing remarks, please go ahead, or else we can close.
No, nothing in particular. So at the Takshashila, we are in fact rolling out a new program called the Graduate Certificate in Liberal Arts, the GCLA. It's going to stick to the same sort of format, which is the 12-week over weekends. But this one's a little different in that they'll have experiential sessions where there's going to be a wine tasting session to something that's, where you get to witness, a classical dance performance. So we're very excited to sort of roll out this program, and if you're interested, do head on over to our website and check it out.
Sure, and we'll also link the information about Graduate Certificate of Liberal Arts in our show notes, so please do check it out. Thank you, Carl, and thanks to everyone for listening in.
Thanks, Sri. Thanks.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcasts app, IVMPodcasts.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.